there is a detail that tends to get lost in the popular story of Attila the Hun. Rome paid him. Not once. Not as a desperate concession at the end of a losing campaign, but repeatedly, systematically across decades. The Eastern Roman Empire, the wealthier, more administratively sophisticated half of the divided empire, transferred enormous sums of gold to the Hunnic court as a matter of official policy. At its height, the annual payment reached 2,100 pounds of gold per year. That is not the behavior of an empire that believed it could defeat an enemy in the field. It is the behavior of a government that had done a rational calculation and determined that payment was cheaper than war. This is where the real story of Attila begins, not on a battlefield, not in the ruins of a sacked city, but at a negotiating table where Roman envoys carrying gold met a leader who had learned to make the threat of violence more useful than violence itself. The version most people carry about Attila is a figure of almost supernatural destruction. He appears in popular memory as the Scourge of God, a title that medieval chroniclers applied to him to make theological sense of the devastation his campaigns left behind. He is the man who made Rome tremble, the horseman who reduced cities to ash, the embodiment of everything the classical world feared from beyond its frontiers. That image has lasted 15 centuries, and it has almost nothing to do with the actual political reality of the 5th century. Attila the Hun was, above all, a ruler. He governed a confederacy of peoples spread across the Eurasian steppe and the Danubian plain. He negotiated treaties, received embassies, managed internal rivalries among client kings, extracted tribute from the most powerful states in the world, and ran a court sophisticated enough to receive Roman diplomats who came away with detailed, largely admiring accounts of what they observed. He did all of this without a standing, bureaucracy, without a fixed capital, and without the kind of territorial infrastructure that Rome had spent centuries building. That is not the portrait of a destroyer. It is the portrait of a ruler operating within a different but coherent system of power. The sources we have are almost entirely Roman. Priscus of Panium, the Greek rhetorician and diplomat who traveled to Attila's camp as part of a Roman embassy in 448 or 449, left the most detailed first-hand account we possess. It is remarkably free of the contempt one might expect. Priscus describes the camp's organization, the protocol of audience with Attila, the food and drink served at the leader's table, the people he encountered there, including, memorably, a Greek merchant who had settled among the Huns and found the life preferable to what he had left behind. Priscus was a trained observer and a careful writer, and, while he was not without his own political perspectives, his account gives us something genuinely unusual. A Roman eyewitness who looked at Hunnic society and described it on its own terms rather than reducing it to a caricature of savagery. The other major sources, Jordanes, writing a century later, and a range of Roman chroniclers and historians, are less reliable and more ideologically saturated. They wrote within a tradition that understood the Huns as a threat to civilization itself, and their accounts must be read against that bias. When a Roman writer describes a Hunnic leader as monstrous in appearance or inhuman in behavior, we are reading as much about Roman anxieties as we are about Hunnic reality. The Huns existed at the outer edge of the Roman conceptual world, a place where cultural difference tended to be translated into moral deficiency. That translation served Roman rhetorical purposes and serves our analytical purposes very poorly. What we can establish from the sources, stripped of their ideological freight, is a picture of a political actor of considerable sophistication. Attila understood the internal dynamics of the Roman world better than Roman writers generally credited. He knew the difference between the Eastern and Western empires, exploited that difference strategically, and timed his pressures to coincide with moments of Roman weakness. He used the threat of force not to destroy but to extract: tribute, diplomatic concessions, the return of fugitives, the elevation of his own prestige within the diplomatic world of the 5th century. When he moved armies, it was almost always in service of a negotiating position, not in pursuit of conquest for its own sake. When he turned away from cities he could theoretically have taken, it was not because of divine intervention or the power of papal authority, but because of supply lines, disease, the difficulty of siege warfare, and the political calculus of what he actually wanted. This is the figure this documentary examines. Not a legend, not a metaphor, not a symbol of barbarian chaos crashing against the walls of civilization. A ruler who lived at one of the most unstable moments in the history of the Western world, who built a system of power suited to that instability, and who bent 2 empires to his will not through unlimited destruction, but through the credible, patient application of threat. Understanding how he did that requires understanding the world he came from, the one he operated in, and the profound limits of the power he built. It requires taking seriously a political system that Rome refused to take seriously, and examining what happened when that system met one that was, in many ways, already failing. What follows is that examination. To understand what the Huns were, it is necessary to set aside what the Romans believed them to be. Roman writers of the 4th and 5th centuries described the Huns as something barely human. They were said to live entirely on horseback, to eat raw meat, to know nothing of agriculture or fixed habitation, to lack the basic social structures that defined civilized existence. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the late 4th century, produced the most elaborate version of this portrait. His Huns have no houses, no cooking fires, no attachment to any particular place. They appear in his account almost as a natural phenomenon, a storm from the east, rather than as a political community with its own internal logic. This portrait tells us a great deal about Ammianus and very little about the Huns. It reflects a well-established Roman literary convention for describing peoples beyond the imperial frontier. That convention had a clear ideological function. It separated the civilized from the uncivilized along lines that happened to coincide with the limits of Roman territorial control. Peoples who lived differently from Romans were not merely different, they were, by definition, lesser. The more different they were, the more vividly their alterity could be rendered as deficiency. The actual Huns were a pastoral nomadic people whose origins lay somewhere in the steppe zone north and east of the Caspian and Black Seas. By the late 4th century, they had moved westward under pressures that remain partially unclear, displacing or incorporating Gothic and other peoples as they moved. Their arrival in the region north of the Danube in the 300s sent shock waves through the Roman world. Not because they were uniquely destructive, but because their movement displaced established Gothic federate relationships with Rome and created a refugee crisis that ended at the Battle of Adrianople in 378, one of the most serious Roman military defeats of the century. But the Huns themselves were not what Adrianople was about. They were the pressure behind the pressure. And in the decades that followed, as they settled into the Danubian and Pannonian regions, roughly the area of modern Hungary, Romania, and the surrounding territories, They developed a political structure that Roman writers consistently misread as chaos, but that was in fact a functioning system of hierarchical authority. Steppe societies operated through confederacy rather than through the kind of centralized, territorially defined state structure that Rome represented. Leadership was not primarily a matter of hereditary right, though descent mattered. It was a matter of demonstrated capacity, the ability to lead successful raids, to attract followers, to distribute rewards, to maintain alliances through a combination of force and generosity. A steppe leader who stopped providing for his followers lost them. There were no bureaucratic mechanisms to compel loyalty, no tax system to fund a permanent administrative apparatus, no infrastructure of roads and garrisons to project authority across a fixed territory. What held a steppe confederation together was the person at its center and the continuous flow of resources that person could secure and distribute. This meant that mobility was not simply a cultural preference or a failure of development. It was a structural feature of the political system. A steppe leader needed to keep moving, literally and politically, because standing still meant losing the capacity to extract resources, which meant losing the ability to reward followers, which meant losing followers. The Hunnic political system was built around motion. It was also built around the absorption of other peoples and their leaders into a hierarchical structure that granted subordinate rulers a degree of autonomy in exchange for military service and political loyalty. The Huns did not exterminate the peoples they dominated. They incorporated them. Gothic, Alan, and other leaders appear in the sources as part of Attila's entourage, commanding their own forces under the Hunnic umbrella. Roman writers looked at this system and saw formlessness. What they were actually seeing was a different form. The Hunnic Confederacy had no equivalent to the Roman Senate, no fixed capital, no written legal code, no permanent army in the Roman sense. It had something else. A leader who could mobilize enormous numbers of mounted warriors on short notice, who could sustain those warriors in the field through a combination of forage, raid, and tribute, and who could use the credible threat of that mobilization as a political instrument without necessarily using the mobilization itself. The Hunnic economy was not purely predatory, as Roman sources imply. The archaeological record suggests settled agricultural communities within Hunnic-dominated territory, trade relationships with neighboring peoples, and material culture that incorporated both steppe traditions and influences from the sedentary world. The image of the Huns as people who owned nothing and wanted nothing except to destroy is a Roman projection. They wanted what all political communities want: security, resources, and the recognition of their standing in the world they occupied. What made the Huns particularly significant in the 5th century was the specific moment at which they arrived at the edge of the Roman world. The Roman Empire, both its eastern and western halves, was under enormous structural stress. Military costs had outrun fiscal capacity. The relationship between the central government and regional military commanders had become increasingly unstable. The federate system, by which non-Roman peoples were settled within imperial territory in exchange for military service, had created internal political dynamics that were difficult to manage. Into this context came a political actor who was organized in a fundamentally different way, who had no interest in the internal legitimacy of the Roman system, and who was willing to use force as a bargaining tool rather than as a means of conquest. The Huns understood Rome well enough to exploit it. Rome understood the Huns barely at all. That asymmetry would define the next 60 years. Attila did not come to power alone. That detail matters, because the conventional narrative tends to present him as a singular figure who emerged from obscurity to dominate the known world. The actual path to his authority was more complicated and more politically interesting than that. The Hunnic Confederation in the early 5th century was ruled by a man named Ruga, also recorded as Rugila. Ruga was Attila's uncle, and under his leadership the Huns had already established the basic template that Attila would later perfect, extracting payments from the Eastern Roman Empire in exchange for not raiding its territory, providing mercenary military service to various Roman factions, and maintaining a position of significant power along the Danubian frontier. When Ruga died, probably in 434, authority passed to his nephews Attila and Bleda, who ruled jointly. Joint rule of this kind was not unusual in steppe confederations. Dividing authority between family members could reduce the risk of the kind of succession conflict that tore confederations apart. It could also allow different leaders to manage different spheres, diplomatic relationships with one set of neighbors, military operations against another, internal management of the various subordinate peoples within the confederation. The practical arrangement between Attila and Bleda is not clearly described in the sources, but it appears that both were recognized as legitimate rulers of the Huns by Roman diplomatic interlocutors, and both participated in the negotiations that followed Ruga's death. Those negotiations produced the Treaty of Margus, probably in 435. The treaty is significant for what it reveals about Hunnic political priorities and Roman strategic calculations at that moment. The Romans agreed to pay an annual tribute of 700 pounds of gold to the Huns, roughly double what had been paid under Ruga. They also agreed to return Hunnic fugitives who had sought refuge on Roman territory, to refrain from making alliances with Hunnic enemies, and to treat Hunnic traders on equal terms with Roman merchants at border markets. In exchange, the Huns agreed to peace. Each of these conditions deserves attention. The doubling of the annual payment reflects the degree to which Hunnic leverage had increased under Ruga, and continued to increase under his successors. The demand for the return of fugitives was not merely punitive, it was about maintaining internal control. Subordinate leaders who escaped Hunnic authority and found shelter within the Roman system represented a political threat. If Rome could absorb or sponsor Hunnic dissidents, it had leverage over the Confederation's internal dynamics. Attila and Bleda were closing that opening. The commercial provisions reflected an interest in economic access that contradicts the image of the Huns as purely predatory. They wanted trade, not just plunder. The Roman perspective on this treaty is filtered through sources that were naturally inclined to present it as a humiliation. Roman writers did not generally describe paying tribute as a rational policy choice. They described it as a necessity forced upon them by military weakness. That framing is understandable but somewhat misleading. The Eastern Roman government of the 400s and 30s was under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. From Persia in the east, from various movements in the western provinces, from internal political conflicts in Constantinople. A negotiated settlement with the Huns, even an expensive one, freed resources and attention for other problems. It was a calculation, not a capitulation. For Attila and Bleda, the treaty represented a significant achievement. They had secured a regular income stream, established diplomatic recognition of their standing as legitimate rulers, and locked in a set of commitments that they could monitor and, when violated, use as justification for further pressure. The treaty was not an end point. It was a platform. How the co-rule between Attila and Bleda functioned over the following years is difficult to trace with precision. They appear together in the sources through the 400s and 30s and into the early 400s and 40s. Both are credited with military operations and diplomatic contacts. The relationship between them may have been genuinely collaborative, or it may have been a managed competition held in check by the external pressures they both faced. What we know is that by 445, Bleda was dead. The sources say that Attila killed his brother. This is possible. Succession violence within ruling families was common in steppe confederations, and the timing, a moment when Attila's personal authority appears to have been consolidating, is consistent with that interpretation. But the sources for this claim are Roman, written well after the fact, and not necessarily reliable on the internal dynamics of the Hunnic court. It is equally possible that Bleda died of natural causes or in a military encounter, and that the fratricide narrative was imposed afterward by writers who understood that it fit established patterns for the transition to sole rule. What is clear is the result. After Bleda's death, Attila was the uncontested leader of the Hunnic Confederation. He concentrated in his own person the full authority of the joint rule, together with whatever personal prestige he had accumulated through the preceding decade of co-rule and military activity. And he moved immediately to use that authority. Within 2 years of Bleda's death, the Eastern Roman Empire was facing a sustained campaign of pressure from the Hunnic Confederation that it had not experienced under the joint rule. The consolidation of authority in Attila's hands changed the strategic situation. Not because Bleda had been a moderating influence. We know too little about Bleda to say anything meaningful about his temperament or preferences, but because unified authority allowed for more coordinated and sustained application of pressure. Attila did not need to manage a partner. He could plan on longer horizons, strike harder bargains, and back those bargains with the full weight of the Confederation's military potential. He used that capacity almost immediately. The gold that flowed from Constantinople to Attila's court was not simply a payment. It was a relationship. Understanding that relationship, what it meant to both parties, how it functioned, what sustained it, and what ultimately disrupted it, is essential to understanding how Attila's power actually worked. Annual tribute in the ancient and medieval world occupied a complex position between diplomacy and extortion. From the paying side, it could be described as a gift, as a subsidy for military service, as a diplomatic gesture of recognition, any framing that softened the implication of subordination. From the receiving side, it was a demonstration of power, a recognition of standing, and a practical resource. The Romans had their own long history of paying subsidies to frontier peoples, and they had well-developed diplomatic language for describing such payments in ways that did not damage Roman prestige too severely. The Huns had their own framework for understanding what the payments meant. They demonstrated that the Romans recognized Hunnic authority as a legitimate political force that required accommodation rather than suppression. 700 pounds of gold per year, the rate established at Margus in 435, was a significant sum. To put it in rough context, it was enough to fund several thousand soldiers for a year or to build substantial public infrastructure. It was not enough to destabilize the Eastern Roman economy, which had the resources of Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant behind it. But it was enough to matter, and it was enough to fund Attila's court, his distribution of rewards to subordinate leaders, and the maintenance of the military potential that gave the tribute its meaning. The tribute was, in effect, self-sustaining. The payments funded the threat that justified the payments. For Attila, the tribute did something that simple raiding could not do. It created a predictable, reliable income stream that required no military action to maintain as long as the treaty held. Raiding generated resources, but it also generated casualties, fatigue, and the kind of destruction that eventually eliminated the productive capacity of the raided territory. Tribute generated resources indefinitely from a territory that remained productive precisely because it was not being destroyed. The economic logic of sustained tribute over episodic raiding was clear, and Attila appears to have understood it clearly. But tribute without a credible threat behind it is just a gift. Attila maintained the credibility of his threat through a combination of demonstrated military capability and careful management of diplomatic signals. He kept Roman envoys aware of his military capacity without necessarily using it. He monitored Roman compliance with treaty terms closely and responded to violations, real or convenient, with escalating pressure rather than immediate military action. This gave him multiple points at which to extract additional concessions before the situation reached open conflict. The diplomatic record of this period, such as it is, shows a pattern of Hunnic grievance followed by Roman accommodation followed by escalation. When the Romans failed to return fugitives as required by the Treaty of Margus, Attila did not immediately launch a campaign. He sent envoys. He made demands. He created a negotiating context in which the Romans could restore compliance or face consequences. When the Romans eventually violated terms, they could not easily restore. When a bishop on the Roman side was alleged to have plundered Hunnic graves, one of the pretexts for the breakdown of the Margus arrangements. Attila moved militarily, but even then the movement had a diplomatic function. It was a demonstration of consequences, not a campaign of extermination. The Priscus account gives us our clearest window into the diplomatic culture of Attila's court. When the Roman embassy that included Priscus arrived at the Hunnic camp in 448 or 449, they entered a world with its own elaborate protocol. Envoys were received according to a hierarchy of seating and service that signaled their relative importance. Attila himself ate and drank from wooden vessels while his subordinates were served from silver. This has sometimes been read as false modesty or performance. It is more likely a calculated signal about authority. Attila did not need the markers of wealth because his power was not based on the display of material opulence. The simplicity of his table was its own statement. The camp itself, as Priscus describes it, was organized and purposeful. There were craftsmen, servants, subordinate leaders with their own households, traders, and a constant flow of envoys from multiple directions. This was not a transient raiding party. It was a peripatetic court, moving across a territory but retaining its structure as it moved. The administrative functions that would have been housed in a palace in Constantinople happened here in a pattern of meetings, audiences, and decisions that moved with the leader. The most revealing moment in Priscus's account concerns the Roman embassy's discovery that one of its members, Vigilas, the interpreter, had been carrying a large sum of gold that exceeded what was needed for the official mission. The gold, when pressed, turned out to be related to a Roman plot to bribe a Hunnic official into arranging Attila's assassination. Attila already knew about the plot. He had known about it before the embassy arrived. He allowed the embassy to proceed, allowed Vigilas to implicate himself, and then confronted the Romans with the evidence. extracting additional concessions, sending vigilas back to Constantinople to return with even more gold as the price of the empire's embarrassment. This episode, in miniature, illustrates Attila's approach to power. He had superior intelligence. He managed his diplomatic relationships as systems, not as individual encounters. He did not respond to the assassination plot with violence against the envoys. He turned it into another extraction opportunity. The threat of exposure and the demonstration that nothing escaped his awareness were worth more than any retaliatory action. Tribute as control required that the payer always understand what the alternative was. Attila made sure they understood. He made sure they understood repeatedly, and at intervals, and from multiple angles. The gold that moved from Constantinople to the Hunnic plain was not a sign of Attila's dominance in some abstract sense. It was the concrete, annual measurement of it. Treaties between Rome and the Hunnic Confederation were not permanent settlements. They were working arrangements, useful to both parties for as long as both parties found them useful. When the calculus changed, when one side believed it could extract more by breaking an agreement than by keeping it, or when violations by the other side provided a legitimate pretext for escalation, the arrangements broke down. This happened repeatedly across the period of Hunnic ascendancy, and the pattern of breakdown is as instructive as the content of the treaties themselves. The Treaty of Margus did not survive the 440s. Its eventual collapse involved a constellation of grievances, some documented, some reconstructed from fragmentary sources, and at least one that may have been more pretext than cause. The alleged desecration of Hunnic burial sites by a Roman bishop on the frontier, a charge difficult to verify but repeatedly invoked in Hunnic diplomatic communications, gave Attila grounds to claim that Rome had violated the spirit of the agreement even when it had technically complied with its terms. Whether the desecration occurred as charged is less important than the fact that it provided a usable justification. Attila was skilled at finding and using such justifications. What he was doing, in structural terms, was managing the escalation of his own demands. The Treaty of Margus had established a payment level and a set of conditions. That level and those conditions were a baseline from which further extraction required either a new treaty or a demonstration of force sufficient to justify new terms. Treaty violation, whether by the Romans or by Attila himself, provided the occasion for renegotiation. Renegotiation under military pressure generally produced terms more favorable to the Hun. The campaigns that followed the breakdown of the Margus arrangements in the early 440s were devastating to the eastern Roman frontier regions. Naissus, the city of Constantine's birth in the Serbian interior, was taken and its population severely depleted. Serdica, Philippopolis, and other significant towns were struck. The Balkans, which had never fully recovered from the disruptions of the late 4th century, suffered additional damage. The scale of this damage should not be minimized. For the populations that experienced it, these campaigns were catastrophic. For Attila, they served a specific political purpose. They demonstrated, concretely and unmistakably, what non-compliance with Hunnic demands cost. The Eastern Roman government of the early 400s was led by Theodosius II, an emperor whose reign was long, but whose engagement with military affairs was limited. The court at Constantinople was managing a difficult set of relationships with imperial generals, with the Western court, with Persia, and now with increasing Hunnic pressure. In 443, facing the prospect of continued Hunnic campaigns in the Balkans, Theodosius agreed to new terms. The annual payment was raised to approximately 2,100 pounds of gold. The arrears accumulated during the period of conflict were paid as a lump sum. The conditions for the return of fugitives were tightened. The price of non-compliance had been clearly established. This was the pattern. Attila did not campaign to destroy. He campaigned to raise the cost of resistance until accommodation became the rational choice. Once accommodation was achieved, the campaigns stopped and the tribute flowed. The Balkans were not a target of extermination. They were a pressure mechanism. Their suffering was the instrument by which Attila communicated with Constantinople. The limits of this approach are also visible in the record. Attila's campaigns in the Balkans caused significant destruction of productive capacity. Towns that had generated tax revenue and trade could not do so while devastated. There is evidence that populations fled southward, reducing the density of settlement in frontier regions. This was not in Attila's long-term interest if he wanted sustainable tribute rather than a single extraction. The balance between demonstrating consequences and maintaining the productivity of the territory being pressured was a genuine tension in his strategy. The Roman side of this equation involved its own calculations. Eastern Roman officials who negotiated with Attila were not simply paying gold to make a problem go away. They were buying time, managing a threat that could not be eliminated militarily with the resources available, and hoping that circumstances would change. Some of those officials also appear to have had personal dealings with Attila and his court that created private interests in maintaining stable relations. Diplomatic exchange in the ancient world created interpersonal bonds and dependencies that complicated official policy in ways that are sometimes visible in the sources, and often must be inferred. The point at which Attila moved from managing the Eastern Empire to redirecting his attention to the West was not a sudden shift. It was a gradual reorientation as the Eastern court, under the regency that followed Theodosius's death in 450, showed signs of stiffening its position. The new Eastern government, under the influence of the military commander Aspar and the new emperor Marcion, refused to continue the gold payments. This was a significant change. It meant that the Eastern tributary relationship, the foundation of Attila's economic system, was no longer reliable. Attila needed either to force the East back into compliance, which would require a major campaign against Constantinople itself, or to find a new source of extraction. Constantinople was genuinely difficult to take. The Theodosian walls, completed in the early 5th century, made the city defensible against forces that lacked sophisticated siege equipment. Attila's military strength lay in mobile warfare, not in the sustained, resource-intensive business of sieging a fortified metropolis. He had never taken a major fortified city by siege, and Constantinople was the most fortified city in the world. The eastern option was possible but expensive and uncertain. The western option was different. The Western Roman Empire was weaker, less administratively coherent, and significantly less well-defended than its eastern counterpart. And in the late 440s, a remarkable diplomatic communication arrived from an unexpected source that gave Attila precisely the pretext he needed to frame a Western campaign as something other than pure aggression. Among the tools available to a ruler like Attila, reputation was perhaps the most efficient. An army must be fed, equipped, and moved across distances. A reputation moves ahead of the army at no cost and does work the army would otherwise have to do. The cultivation and management of that reputation, understanding what people feared, allowing that fear to project ahead of any actual military action, and using the gap between the threat and the reality as a space for negotiation, was central to how Attila operated. The Roman sources give us evidence of this, though not always in ways the writers intended. When they describe populations fleeing before Attila even reached their location, they are describing exactly what Attila needed to happen. A city that abandoned itself saved him the cost and time of taking it. A garrison that melted away rather than defend a wall did the same thing. Every time fear performed the work that force would otherwise have required, Attila's military capacity went further. This was not accidental. Reputation of this kind had to be built and maintained. It required real demonstrations of what happened to those who resisted, not universal, indiscriminate destruction, but selective, visible consequences that informed the wider audience of what awaited them if they made the wrong choice. The campaigns in the Balkans in the early 440s served this function alongside their tribute extraction purpose. Nisus, devastated and depopulated, was a message. Its condition, visible to anyone traveling through the region, communicated something that no envoy needed to say explicitly. Priscus, traveling to Attila's camp in the late 440s, passed through the ruins of Nisus and recorded what he saw. The vicinity of the city was deserted. The riverbanks were scattered with human bones. Survivors of the catastrophe were living in makeshift shelters outside what remained of the urban structure. This was not recent destruction. It had happened years earlier, and the territory had not recovered. Priscus noted it without elaboration, but the note itself is significant. A trained rhetorician and diplomat, accustomed to the condition of Roman cities, found the sight remarkable enough to record. The message that the ruins of Nisus sent to everyone who passed through had not degraded. Fear, properly maintained, has a long half-life. The management of this reputation also required Attila to be present in the imaginations of those he sought to influence, not as a remote abstraction, but as a specific, concrete threat that could arrive at a specific location with a specific force. This meant keeping Roman officials well informed about Hunnic military capabilities without allowing that information to become so precise that it could be used to identify specific weaknesses. The diplomatic exchanges of the period served this function alongside their more obvious purposes. Every embassy that returned from Attila's court carried with it an impression of the camp, its size, its organization, the confidence of its leader, the deference of his subordinates. These impressions circulated through the court at Constantinople and contributed to the collective assessment of what the Huns could do. The picture that emerged was one of formidable military potential. Whether it was as formidable as the impression suggested is difficult to assess. Roman military writers and historians consistently overstated the size and capability of external threats. It served their rhetorical and political purposes to do so, and it made the eventual accommodation or victory more impressive by making the threat appear larger. But the Huns were genuinely capable of large-scale, rapid, coordinated military operations over extended distances, and this capability was real enough to justify the Roman estimation of it as dangerous. Fear, as a political tool, also required consistency between the threat and its execution. If Attila threatened consequences, and then failed to deliver them when his conditions were not met, his credibility degraded, and the threat became less useful. This created a structural pressure toward following through on threats even when doing so was costly. The campaigns of the 440s were in part a credibility maintenance operation, demonstrating, again, that the threat was real, that non-compliance had consequences, that the Roman calculation of whether to pay or resist needed to account for the actual, demonstrated cost of resistance. There is something clarifying about examining fear as an instrument rather than as an outcome. It removes the moral dimension from the analysis, not because the moral dimension is unimportant, but because it obscures the mechanism. Attila did not use fear because he was cruel. He used it because it worked, because it was more efficient than constant military action, and because the political system he operated within rewarded those who could make their capabilities felt without, continuously expending them. This is not unique to Attila or to steppe rulers. Roman generals used fear in exactly the same way. The calculated destruction of enemy settlements as a demonstration of power was standard Roman military practice. The difference was that Rome had the infrastructure to follow up fear with sustained occupation, while Attila did not. His system was built around the perpetual threat rather than the permanent presence. The people who lived within range of Hunnic military action did not experience this as a political system. They experienced it as terror. The gap between Attila's strategic calculus and the lived reality of those on the receiving end of that calculus is genuine and should not be minimized. But it also should not determine our analysis of how the system worked. Understanding the mechanism does not require endorsing the outcomes. What the system produced, in the years between Attila's consolidation of sole power after Bleda's death and his turn toward the west in the late 440s, was a period of sustained pressure on the Eastern Roman Empire that fundamentally altered the strategic balance between the two powers. Constantinople was paying over 2,000 pounds of gold per year to a ruler who had no permanent territory, no standing army in the Roman sense, and no administrative apparatus capable of managing anything like a Roman province. The gap between what Attila had and what he extracted from those who had more was a measure of how effectively he had made fear perform the work that material power alone could not. By the late 440s, the configuration of power in Attila's world was changing. The Eastern Roman court, having absorbed the costs of the 440s campaigns and the escalated tribute demands that followed, was beginning to show signs of a different approach. When Theodosius II died in 450, the accession of Marcian, an emperor with a military background and a different temperament, signaled a change in Eastern policy. Marcian refused to continue the gold payments. He is said to have told Hunnic envoys that he had gold for friends and steel for enemies. This was a calculated posture. The Eastern court was betting that the logistical and military challenges of attacking Constantinople made Attila unlikely to launch a full-scale Eastern campaign. The bet was not unreasonable. Attila had never successfully conducted siege operations against a major fortified city. His military strength was in mobility and in the ability to ravage open territory. The Theodosian walls of Constantinople represented a fundamentally different kind of military problem. Attila had campaigned in the Balkans repeatedly without approaching Constantinople itself. The Eastern government understood that the threat to the city was limited, and they were willing to absorb whatever Hunnic pressure on frontier regions followed from Marcian's refusal to pay. For Attila, this created a genuine problem. The Eastern tributary relationship had been the primary economic foundation of the Confederation for over a decade. If that relationship ended, it needed to be replaced. The replacement options were limited. He could launch a major campaign against Constantinople, expensive, logistically difficult, and uncertain in outcome. He could turn elsewhere. The elsewhere that presented itself was the Western Roman Empire. The Western Empire in 450 was in a different condition than its eastern counterpart. It was smaller in effective territory, weaker fiscally, more dependent on federate military forces whose loyalty was contingent on continued payment and political accommodation, and governed by a court at Ravenna that struggled to project authority across the provinces it nominally controlled. The effective military power of the Western Empire was concentrated in the hands of Flavius Aetius, the Magister Militum, the commander of the Western forces, who had his own complex history with the Huns. Aetius had spent time as a hostage among the Huns in his youth, probably under Ruga's rule. He had developed relationships with Hunnic leaders and had used Hunnic military forces in his political struggles within the Western Empire. He understood the Huns at a level that most Roman commanders did not, and he had shaped his career around the utility of the Hunnic military alliance. In the late 430s and 440s, that alliance had served Aetius well. But by 450, the political situation had shifted in ways that made the relationship more complicated. Into this context came the letter from Honoria. Justa Grata Honoria was the sister of the Western Emperor Valentinian III. Her exact motivations are not fully recoverable from the sources, but the broad outlines are clear enough. She had been caught in a compromising situation. Some sources describe an affair with a steward, and faced the prospect of a politically arranged marriage that would remove her from court influence. She sent a message to Attila, accompanied by her ring, which could be interpreted as a proposal or an appeal for help. The sources, which are all hostile to Honoria, and all written from a perspective that found her behavior scandalous, tend to present this as an invitation to marry. And Attila, according to the same sources, interpreted it as exactly that. Whether Attila genuinely believed Honoria was offering him marriage, or whether he seized on her communication as a pretext that gave his Western campaign a legitimating narrative, is impossible to determine with certainty. What we can observe is that he used it. He sent envoys to the Western court claiming Honoria as his intended bride and demanding half of the Western Empire as her dowry. The demand was politically absurd. No Roman court could have accepted it, and that absurdity may have been the point. It was a justification designed to be refused, so that refusal could serve as the occasion for a campaign that was going to happen anyway. The political opportunity was real regardless of Honoria. The Franks and the Visigoths, who controlled substantial territories within and adjacent to the Western Empire, were themselves in a period of internal conflict over succession. Attila had interests in these conflicts. He supported one Frankish claimant. The Visigoths were under a king named Theodoric I, who had his own reasons for concern about Hunnic intentions, and the whole constellation of relationships in Gaul and the Rhine frontier was shifting. A campaign into the west was not simply an opportunistic raid, it was an intervention into a complex political situation with multiple possible alignments and outcomes. Attila moved into Gaul in early 451 with a force that the sources describe in terms suggesting enormous size. The exact numbers are impossible to verify, and almost certainly inflated by sources writing with a rhetorical interest in making the threat appear overwhelming. But the force was large enough to move through Gaul, destroying or threatening several cities, reaching as far as Orleans before the military response began to form. That response was organized by Aetius, the man who had made his career partly through Hunnic alliances, now leading a coalition against his former allies. The coalition included Romans, Visigoths under Theodoric, Alans, Franks, and various other Federate forces. The fact that Aetius could assemble this coalition was itself a measure of how the political situation had changed since the days when Hunnic military force was a tool Aetius deployed for his own purposes. Attila's move into the west had created something the Hunnic pressure on the Eastern Empire had never produced: a unified military response. The confrontation toward which both sides were now moving would not resolve the situation in the way that either side might have hoped, but it would demonstrate, with unusual clarity, the limits of what military action could accomplish in this particular configuration of power. The engagement that took place somewhere in northeastern Gaul in the summer of 451, known variously as the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, the Battle of Chalon, or the Battle of the Mauriac Plain, is one of the most discussed military events of late antiquity. It has been described as one of the decisive battles of world history, the moment that saved Western civilization from the Hunnic tide. This framing is dramatically satisfying and analytically misleading. The sources for the battle are fragmentary and contradictory. Jordanes, writing more than a century after the event from sources that themselves had filtered the story through multiple layers of transmission, gives the most detailed account we have. It is vivid, structured around dramatic narrative conventions, and probably unreliable in its specifics. The exact location of the battle remains uncertain. The size of the forces involved is unknown. The precise sequence of events, who attacked when, how the lines held or broke, what happened during the night after the main engagement, cannot be reconstructed with confidence from the available evidence. What can be established is that the battle was fought, that both sides suffered significant losses, and that neither side was destroyed. Theodoric I, king of the Visigoths, died in the fighting. Whether in the main engagement or in the confusion afterward is unclear. His death removed one of the key figures in the coalition and created a succession situation among the Visigoths that had its own implications. Attila's forces held their camp and were not destroyed. The coalition forces did not press an attack that might have finished the campaign decisively. The decision not to press the attack is often attributed to Aetius. The sources, particularly Jordanes, suggest that Aetius deliberately held back the Visigoths after their king's death, perhaps fearing that a total Hunnic defeat would remove a counterbalance that kept the Visigoths in a subordinate position, and that a Visigothic victory over Attila would create a more dangerous adversary from a Roman perspective. This is a plausible interpretation of Aetius's thinking, given his known tendency to balance rather than eliminate threats. But it is also a reconstruction that reads strategic calculation into a situation that may have been shaped as much by tactical exhaustion, supply limitations, and the confusion of a major engagement as by any deliberate political decision. What is not in dispute is that Attila withdrew. His forces returned across the Rhine in reasonable order. They had not been destroyed. They had not been routed in the way that Roman sources sometimes imply when they discuss the battle as a decisive Roman victory. Attila's military capacity was diminished by the losses of the campaign, but it was not eliminated. He retained the core of the Confederation's fighting strength, the loyalty of his subordinate leaders, and the political authority that came from his position at the center of the Hunnic system. The argument that the Catalaunian Plains saved the West from Hunnic domination rests on an assumption that requires examination: that Attila intended to conquer and permanently occupy the Western Empire. The evidence for this intention is thin. Attila's track record in the East suggests that permanent occupation was not his goal. He had been in a position to devastate the Eastern Empire's frontier regions repeatedly, and had never attempted to hold territory there in any permanent sense. His political system did not require territory. It required tribute and deference. A conquered Gaul would have been ungovernable by Hunnic institutions. What Attila could do with Gaul was extract from it, pressure it, and use it as a demonstration of capability. The battle, in this framing, was an attempt that went further than planned, met unexpected resistance, and ended in a draw. The unexpected resistance came specifically from the Visigothic, component of the coalition, a force that Attila had presumably assessed as potentially manageable. The coalition that Aetius assembled was, in military terms, probably the most formidable force the Western Empire could put in the field, drawing on the federate military capacity that Aetius had spent decades cultivating. Attila encountered it at a moment when he may have underestimated its cohesion. The aftermath of the battle was not a Roman recovery of Western Gaul. It was a continuation of the same strategic uncertainty that had preceded the campaign. The coalition dissolved as its component parts pursued their separate interests. The Visigoths, with a new king to establish, returned to their own territory. Aetius had no means to press a pursuit even if he had wanted to. And Attila, recognizing that the Western campaign had not achieved what a successful Eastern-style extraction campaign would have achieved, turned south toward Italy. The decision to invade Italy in 452 followed, directly from the inconclusive outcome in Gaul. The Western campaign needed to produce returns, tribute, concessions, something that justified the mobilization and demonstrated the continued relevance of Hunnic military threat. Italy, the heartland of the Western Empire, was the obvious next pressure point. Rome itself, the symbolic and historic center of the imperial tradition, even though it had not been the actual administrative capital for decades, lay within reach. What the Catalaunian Plains actually decided was relatively modest. It prevented Attila from establishing a position in Gaul from which sustained pressure on the Western Empire could be maintained. It forced the campaign south rather than terminating it. And it demonstrated, perhaps more clearly than anything else in Attila's career, that the Hunnic system of power had limits. A sufficiently motivated coalition could, under the right leadership, resist the military application of that power in the field. Whether it could do so consistently over time was a different question. But the encounter at Chalons showed that the threat was not unlimited. The strategic situation after the battle was different from before it, but the difference was of degree, not of kind. Attila retained his authority, his military forces, and his political standing. The Western Empire retained its institutional structure. Neither had decisively altered the position of the other. The next phase would be fought in Italy, and it would not be decided militarily. The invasion of Italy in 452 is better documented than the Gallic campaign, and offers a clearer picture of how Attila's military operations actually worked. Their logic, their limits, and the factors that shaped their outcomes. Attila's forces entered northeastern Italy through the passes of the Eastern Alps in the spring of 452. The first major objective was Aquileia, a significant city at the head of the Adriatic and one of the key nodes in the road network of northern Italy. Aquileia had walls, and it resisted. The siege was prolonged. The sources, with their usual imprecision on time, give accounts ranging from several months to a shorter period, and the eventual fall of the city was apparently complete enough to leave it severely depopulated. the destruction of Aquileia became a landmark reference point in medieval accounts of the invasion, cited by later writers as the founding trauma of the refugee movement that eventually produced Venice. The reality of what happened at Aquileia was significant, but was not the annihilation of later legend. The population suffered severely. The city's infrastructure was damaged. But cities do not disappear from a single sack, and the subsequent trajectory of Aquileia, while dramatically diminished, was not extinction. The medieval narrative of total destruction served purposes, explaining the origin of Venice, dramatizing the magnitude of the Hunnic threat, that had more to do with later political and religious contexts than with accurate historical memory. Following Aquileia, Hunnic forces moved westward along the Po Valley. Mediolanum, modern Milan, one of the most important cities in northern Italy and a former imperial residence, was taken. Ticinum, Verona, and other significant Po Valley cities were struck or threatened. The pattern across northern Italy was not uniform destruction, but a variable experience. Some places were taken with force, some apparently submitted without resistance. Some were reached, and some were not. The geography of the campaign is significant. Northern Italy, the Po Plain, was accessible to cavalry forces in a way that other parts of the peninsula were not. The open ground favored Hunnic mobility. Moving south of the Po, however, meant entering terrain that narrowed options for large cavalry forces, and it meant extending supply lines across a region that was itself being stripped of resources by the campaign. The further south, Attila's forces moved from their base in the Po Valley, the more difficult the logistics became. Supply was the fundamental constraint on the Italian campaign, as it had been on every Hunnic campaign. The Hunnic system of feeding a large army in the field relied on a combination of forage, seizure of local provisions, and the efficient movement of the force before any given area was exhausted. Italy in 452 provided some of these resources, but it was a densely settled region with a complex economy, not an open steppe. Cities that were sacked yielded portable wealth, but destroyed the local productive capacity that would have sustained a longer presence. The army that could move rapidly and live off the countryside could not indefinitely occupy the same ground. Added to the supply problem was disease. The sources mention pestilence as a factor in the Italian campaign. The precise nature of what struck the Hunnic forces is unknown. 5th century medical knowledge was not specific enough to allow reliable identification of disease from textual descriptions. But the combination of campaign conditions, the density of Italy's population creating disease vectors unfamiliar to a steppe force, and the summer heat of the Po Valley created conditions in which epidemic disease was both likely and devastating. Military campaigns of this period regularly produced significant casualties from disease that exceeded battle losses, and there is no reason to think Attila's Italian campaign was an exception. The cumulative effect of supply difficulties and disease was to limit the campaign's southward reach. Attila did not march on Rome. Whether he intended to at any point in the campaign, whether Rome was an objective or a symbolic pressure point, is not fully clear from the sources. What is clear is that the army that had crossed into Italy in the spring was in diminished condition by the summer, and that the strategic situation, Eastern Roman forces reportedly crossing into Illyricum to threaten the Hunnic rear, the supply situation in Italy deteriorating, made a continued drive southward increasingly unattractive. The Western court at Ravenna was in no position to field a military response. Aetius, who had organized the coalition at Chalons, did not assemble a comparable force to defend Italy. The sources suggest that Aetius was unable to secure the military resources necessary for a major field campaign on this occasion. The coalition of the previous year had been a one-time assembly that did not represent a standing military capacity. The Western Empire's inability to defend its Italian heartland was a stark demonstration of how far its effective military power had declined. It was in this context, an army operating in Italy without effective military opposition, but constrained by supply and disease, with pressure building from the east, that an embassy from Rome came north to negotiate. The embassy was led, in the accounts that have survived, by a delegation that included Pope Leo I. This meeting, which took place somewhere in northern Italy in 452, has become one of the most celebrated and mythologized moments of late antiquity. The image is one of the most powerful in the iconography of Western Christianity. The Bishop of Rome standing before the conqueror from the east. The force of spiritual authority halting an army that no military power had stopped. Leo I, later called the Great, meeting Attila the Hun somewhere on the banks of the Mincio River. The mosaic in St. Peter's Basilica, the paintings by Raphael, the centuries of theological elaboration around this encounter, all of them carry a version of events in which divine intervention, channeled through the Pope, prevented the destruction of Rome. The historical reality was more prosaic and more interesting. The embassy to Attila was not a solo performance by Leo I. It included Trigetius, a former prefect with experience in diplomatic negotiations, and Avianus, a former consul. These were senior figures in the Western Roman administrative tradition, men whose presence signaled that the meeting was a formal diplomatic encounter between the Western court and the Hunnic ruler, organized by the court at Ravenna and executed with established diplomatic protocol. Leo's presence, and he was a figure of growing authority and prestige within the church, added a different kind of weight. But the embassy was not simply a papal initiative. It was a government operation in which the Pope participated alongside experienced diplomats. What was negotiated in this meeting is not preserved in any source that gives us the specific terms. We know the outcome. Attila did not march further south. His forces remained in northern Italy for a period after the meeting, and then withdrew from the peninsula. The traditional explanation, that Leo's eloquence and the miraculous appearance of saints. Peter and Paul deterred Attila through divine intimidation, comes from later hagiographic sources that are explicitly interested in establishing Leo's spiritual credentials. As historical evidence for what actually deterred Attila, it is not useful. The factors that explain Attila's decision to leave Italy are better sought in the material and strategic conditions of the campaign. The supply situation in the Po Valley by late summer 452 was significantly degraded by months of campaign activity. The disease that had affected the army was real and ongoing. News of Eastern Roman military movements into Illyricum, forces crossing under the general Aetius's counterpart in the east, created a threat to the Hunnic rear and to the Confederation's home territory. And the Italian campaign, despite its impressive geographic reach, had not produced the kind of tribute settlement that would have given it clear political value. There was nothing more to extract from northern Italy by remaining there. The available portable wealth had been taken, and the cities that had surrendered were not going to produce ongoing tribute payments. The meeting with Leo provided something of political value that had nothing to do with the theological interpretation placed on it later. It gave Attila a diplomatic framework for withdrawal that was not simply a retreat. A negotiated disengagement, preceded by a formal audience with a senior Roman delegation, allowed the Hunnic ruler to present the withdrawal as a political decision rather than a military necessity. The face-saving function of the embassy was not a small thing. In a political system built on reputation, the manner of withdrawal mattered. There may also have been substantive commitments made in the meeting, promises of tribute or ransom payments, undertakings about the situation of Roman prisoners, possibly arrangements related to Honoria, whose situation had been the nominal pretext for the Western campaign. The sources do not give us the content of what was agreed, which means we cannot confirm this, but it is consistent with the pattern of Hunnic diplomatic practice to have extracted something concrete from the encounter. What the meeting was not was a spiritual confrontation between Christian civilization and pagan destruction. It was a negotiation between representatives of a failing state and a ruler who had achieved his campaign objectives within the limits of what his military force could accomplish, and who was making a rational calculation about whether to proceed further south. The calculation came out against proceeding. Rome was not taken. The city's survival has been interpreted in religious and civilizational terms for 15 centuries. It would be more accurate to say that it survived because Attila did not need to take it and could not have held it if he had. Rome was not the administrative center of the Western Empire. That was Ravenna. It was not a significant military objective. Its symbolic importance was enormous, but symbolism was not something Attila's political system could convert into tribute. Taking Rome would have been a logistical achievement of enormous cost for minimal practical return. Leaving Italy after a campaign that had extracted substantial wealth and demonstrated unmistakable military capability was the better political decision. The story of the meeting with Leo became what it became because later ages needed it to mean something beyond its immediate context. A world in which Rome's survival was a matter of strategic calculation rather than divine protection was not a world that medieval Christendom could easily accommodate. Leo himself was a figure of increasing institutional authority, who had reason to emphasize the spiritual dimensions of his role. The hagiographic tradition that surrounded him converted a diplomatic encounter into a miracle, and the miracle became one of the foundational stories of papal authority. History is often converted into myth at the moment when myth becomes more useful than history. The meeting with Leo is as clear an example of that conversion as the record of late antiquity provides. It is worth pausing at this point in Attila's career to examine the structure of the power he had built, not as it appeared from the outside, from the Roman perspective that dominates the sources, but as it functioned from within. What held the Hunnic confederation together? What were the mechanisms by which Attila maintained authority over dozens of subordinate leaders, each with their own military forces and their own interests? And what did the maintenance of that authority require of him, continuously, without possibility of cessation? The central paradox of steppe political power is that it is most formidable at the moment of its greatest extension and most vulnerable in its aftermath. A successful campaign that produces significant wealth, portable goods, gold, Roman tribute payments, creates the resources necessary to reward subordinate leaders and maintain their loyalty. But the subordinate leaders rewarded by one campaign develop expectations about the next. A leader who cannot continue producing returns faces a restive following. There is no administrative mechanism to compel continued loyalty. It must be earned continuously through the demonstration of capacity and the distribution of rewards. Attila had been extraordinarily successful in producing returns for his confederation across the decade and a half of his sole rule. The tribute payments from the Eastern Empire had provided a reliable income stream that subsidized the maintenance of alliances without requiring continuous military expenditure. The campaigns in the Balkans had demonstrated military capacity and raised the tribute levels. The Western campaigns had produced plunder and demonstrated geographic reach that impressed subordinate leaders accustomed to thinking of the Hunnic sphere as bounded by the Danubian world. But the Western campaigns had also revealed the limits of the system. The Gallic campaign had not produced a tributary relationship with the Western Empire equivalent to what had existed with the Eastern. The Italian campaign had produced portable wealth but not ongoing tribute. The Eastern Empire under Marcian was refusing to resume gold payments. The combination of factors meant that by the time Attila returned from Italy in 452, the economic foundation of the Confederation's cohesion was less secure than it had been at the peak of the Eastern tributary relationship. This is not visible in the sources, which generally present Attila as commanding absolute loyalty until his sudden death. But the structural logic of the system suggests that the pressure was there. Subordinate leaders who had followed Attila across the Rhine and into Italy had experienced campaigns that were costly in manpower and did not produce the kind of clean, treaty-based income stream that the Eastern tribute had provided. The Hunnic Confederation in 452 to 453 was at a historical moment where its future depended on what came next, and what came next was uncertain. Attila was planning another campaign. The sources, again fragmentary on this period, suggest that he was considering a renewed Eastern campaign, perhaps to force Marcian back into the tributary relationship, or possibly operations in a different direction. The Confederation's leadership expected continued activity. There were also internal dynamics to manage. The various subject peoples within the Confederation had their own interests, and the degree to which those interests aligned with Attila's continued rule depended on his continued success. Gothic, Alan, and other subordinate leaders had been incorporated into the Hunnic system, but they were not without their own political agency. The Priscus account and the fragmentary diplomatic record of the period suggest that Attila was also managing a complex set of relationships with figures within the Roman world. Officials who had personal dealings with the Hunnic court, diplomatic contacts cultivated over years of negotiation, merchants who operated across the frontier. All of these represented connections that Attila could use, or that could be used against him. The attempted assassination that Priscus witnessed being exposed demonstrates that Roman elements were willing to take direct action against him. The failure of that attempt, and Attila's theatrical handling of it, reinforced his image of omniscience and invulnerability. But it also demonstrated that external actors were willing to invest in his removal. The Hunnic court itself was not free of internal tension. Attila had multiple wives, as was customary among Hunnic rulers, and questions of succession were present in any political system that concentrated authority as completely as his did. His sons, Elek, Dengizic, and Ernak among them, were figures whose future roles were presumably under consideration. The question of who would succeed Attila, and whether the Confederation would survive the succession, was one that his subordinate leaders must have been thinking about even while he lived. What the years 452 to 453 represent, in retrospect, is the beginning of the period in which the system's dependency on Attila's personal authority was becoming more, not less, acute. The returns from the Western campaigns had been insufficient to establish the kind of tributary arrangement that could sustain the Confederation's cohesion without continuous military demonstration. The Eastern tribute had been cut off. The next campaign had not yet materialized. And, in the midst of this strategic uncertainty, in the early months of 453, Attila died. The death of Attila in 453 is described in the sources in terms that resist confident interpretation. The most widely cited account comes from Jordanes, drawing on material ultimately derived from Priscus. Attila died on the night following a wedding celebration. He had taken a new wife, a woman named Ildiko, and in the morning his attendants, concerned by his failure to emerge and by sounds of lamentation from within his quarters, broke down the door and found him dead in a pool of blood, with Ildiko beside him weeping and unable to speak. The blood, the sudden death, the new wife, the locked room, these elements have naturally generated speculation across 15 centuries. The most dramatic interpretation is that Ildiko murdered him, either on her own initiative or as part of a Roman-sponsored assassination. The sources who mention this possibility do not commit to it. They present it as one interpretation among several. The hagiographic tradition surrounding figures like Leo I, who had recently negotiated with Attila, sometimes implies divine intervention, the death appearing as a providential deliverance just as a new military campaign was being organized. The most probable medical explanation, though impossible to confirm from the sources available, is hemorrhage, internal bleeding, possibly from a ruptured blood vessel, possibly associated with heavy alcohol consumption during the wedding celebration. The ancient sources sometimes mention Attila's drinking, and there is nothing implausible about a man in his mid to late 40s, under the stress of sustained political activity and military campaigning, dying of a hemorrhagic event during a period of celebration. Nosebleed is mentioned by some accounts as the immediate apparent cause. Priscus's account, as preserved through Jordanes, uses a word that suggests blood from the nose or throat. A severe hemorrhage of this kind, occurring during sleep or semi-consciousness, could produce death without any external violence. The assassination theory cannot be ruled out. Ildiko was, by some accounts, the daughter of a Germanic tribal leader, and the political circumstances of the wedding, what it represented, who had arranged it, what interests were served by her proximity to Attila, are largely opaque to us. Roman intelligence had attempted assassination before. The episode involving Vigilas and the bribed official had been only a few years earlier. Whether a second attempt succeeded where the first failed is possible, but the evidence is not sufficient to establish it. What can be established is the consequence of the death, which was immediate and transformative. The Hunnic confederation that had held together under Attila's personal authority for nearly 20 years did not transfer that authority to his successors. It began to fragment almost immediately, in ways that the structural logic of the confederation, its dependency on the central authority of the ruler, had always implied was possible. The rituals surrounding Attila's death, as described by the sources, were elaborate. His body was laid in state and then placed in a series of coffins, gold, silver, and iron according to the tradition, and buried at a location kept secret from all who did not participate in the burial, with those who had dug the grave reportedly killed afterward to prevent anyone from knowing the location. The secrecy of the burial was not simply a cultural practice, it was a deliberate political act, preventing the grave from becoming a site of pilgrimage that could serve the political purposes of any particular successor. The mourning itself was described as a formal practice. Warriors who had served under Attila rode around his burial place and performed a ceremony that the sources call a strava, a funerary feast of a kind attested in steppe cultures. This ceremony was both a genuine expression of loss and a political ritual that marked the transition between the old authority and whatever came next. It was an occasion at which subordinate leaders, who had come together for the burial as was required, could assess each other's positions and begin the calculations that would determine the shape of the succession. The question of succession in a system that lacked formal inheritance mechanisms was always the most dangerous moment in the life of a steppe confederation. The authority that had resided in Attila was personal. It could not be transferred by document or by administrative arrangement. It had to be established again by whoever claimed it through the same combination of demonstrated capacity and distributed reward that had built it in the first place. And the resources available for that process, the tribute from the Eastern Empire, the portable wealth extracted from Western campaigns, were in a different condition than they had been when Attila first consolidated his rule after Bleda's death. His sons had names in the sources. They were present, and they had claims. But the claims of multiple sons in a system without primogeniture were an invitation to conflict rather than a mechanism for stable succession. And the subordinate leaders of the Confederation, the Gothic, Alan, and other kings who had served under Attila, had their own calculations to make about whether continued service to one or another of his sons was in their interest, or whether the moment of transition created an opportunity to reassert their own independence. Attila died suddenly, without a clear succession mechanism, at a moment when the Confederation's external resource flows were diminished, and its internal dependencies on his personal authority were maximally acute. The timing, from the perspective of the Confederation's survival, could not have been worse. What followed demonstrated, with considerable clarity, exactly how fragile the structure he had built actually was. The disintegration of the Hunnic Confederation after Attila's death in 453 was rapid by the standards of political institutions, though not instantaneous. The process unfolded over roughly 2 years and produced a final military confrontation that ended the Hunnic Confederation as a major political force in Europe. Understanding why it collapsed so quickly is as analytically important as understanding how it was built. Attila left multiple sons, and the succession dispute was immediate. The sources name Elak, the eldest, as having had some degree of privileged status during his father's lifetime, but the privilege of birth did not translate into uncontested authority in a system that had always rewarded demonstrated capacity over hereditary right. The subordinate peoples within the Confederation, the Gepids, the Ostrogoths, and various other groups that had been incorporated into the Hunnic system over the preceding decades, saw in the succession dispute an opportunity that they moved quickly to exploit. The Gepids, under their king Ardaric, who had been one of Attila's most trusted subordinate leaders, took the initiative. The sources suggest that Ardaric had the most prominent position among the kings who served under Attila, and that his revolt against Hunnic authority after Attila's death was both a calculated political move and the action that triggered the Confederation's final collapse. Other subordinate peoples joined the revolt, including the Ostrogoths, who had been under Hunnic domination since before Attila's time and who had their own reasons for seeking independence. The decisive military encounter occurred at the Battle of Nedao in Pannonia in 454, within a year of Attila's death. The battle pitted the rebel coalition against the Hunnic forces under Elak. Elak was killed in the fighting. The Hunnic military force, which had been the instrument of cohesion holding the Confederation together, was broken by the same kinds of allied forces that the Huns themselves had used throughout Attila's campaigns. The defeated Hunnic remnant withdrew, first to the eastern Danubian region, and then further east, back toward the steppe zones from which they had originally come. The speed of this collapse illuminates the structural characteristics of the system that had produced it. The Hunnic Confederation had been held together not by territory, not by administrative infrastructure, not by shared ethnic identity or institutional loyalty. It had been held together by Attila, by his ability to demonstrate success, distribute rewards, manage internal rivalries, and project the threat that kept external resources flowing. When he died, every element of that structural cohesion disappeared simultaneously. There was no institution that could substitute for his personal authority, no established succession mechanism that could transfer his specific combination of political skills to an heir, and no reservoir of external tribute income that could fund the transition. The comparison with Rome is instructive. The Roman Empire went through periods of succession crisis that were severe, and it produced emperors who were military commanders with limited administrative experience. But it had institutions: the Senate, the army's command structure, the provincial administrative system, the legal framework, that continued to function regardless of the quality of individual emperors. These institutions did not save the Western Empire, which failed anyway over the course of the 5th century, but they gave it a resilience that allowed it to persist through repeated leadership crises. The Hunnic Confederation had none of these buffers. The Eastern Roman Empire's response to the collapse was carefully managed. Marcian, who had refused to continue tribute payments and who had reportedly sent forces into Illyricum while Attila was in Italy, now received the fragments of the Hunnic Confederation in a very different diplomatic posture. Some Hunnic groups sought to maintain relations with Constantinople, offering military service in exchange for subsidies, the old federate arrangement, now from a position of weakness rather than strength. Others dispersed into the broader world of the steppe and the Danubian frontier, their political identity dissolving as the confederation that had given it meaning ceased to exist. Dengizic, one of Attila's sons, attempted in the early 460s to restore Hunnic influence through a combination of diplomatic pressure and military action against the Eastern Empire. He demanded a tribute in terms that recalled his father's demands. He was rebuffed. His forces were defeated in 469, and Dengizic himself was killed. His head was paraded through Constantinople, a deliberate, symbolic statement that the threat his father had embodied was gone, and that the Eastern Empire no longer felt compelled to accommodate it. The other surviving sons, Ernak in particular, moved further east, into the steppe zone north of the Black Sea, where their descendants merged into the populations of the region and ceased to be historically traceable as a distinct political entity. The Huns, as a political force in European history, effectively ended with Attila. The confederation that had extracted gold from 2 empires and sent armies across Gaul and into Italy was gone within 2 years of his death. This tells us something fundamental about the nature of what Attila had built. It was real power, formidable, far-reaching, and, for a period, genuinely determinative of the political landscape of the Western world. But it was power without permanence, without the institutional structures that allow political systems to survive the deaths of the individuals who created them. It was a monument to what one person could accomplish within a specific historical moment and within a specific political system. And It was, by the same token, a demonstration of what happens to such monuments when the moment passes. Attila the Hun died in 453, and the edifice of his power collapsed within 2 years of his death. Rome, both its eastern and western incarnations, survived him, as did the Gothic kingdoms, the Church, the provinces, the administrative traditions of late antiquity. He did not end the ancient world. He did not bring down the Roman Empire, which had another 23 years in the west before the deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476, and which continued in the east for another 1,000 years. The myth of Attila as the scourge of God, the destroyer, the man who broke civilization, that myth says much more about the medieval world that generated it than about the 5th century figure who inspired it. What Attila actually was is more interesting than the myth, and in some ways more difficult to hold in the mind. He was a ruler of a political system that worked on different principles than Rome, but that was no less real for the difference. He was a diplomatist who understood the leverage that military capacity created and used it with considerable sophistication over more than 15 years of sole rule. He was an extractor who turned the fear of his military potential into a reliable income stream from the wealthiest states in the world. He was a coalition manager who held together a confederation of diverse peoples without the institutional tools that Rome would have used to perform the same function. And he was, finally, a demonstration of the limits of personal power, of what happens to systems built entirely on the capacity of a single person when that person is gone. The sources through which we know him are almost entirely hostile or at least external. Roman writers had every reason to emphasize his destructiveness and his alien nature, and they did. The rhetorical tradition they worked within had its own conventions for describing external threats, and those conventions bent the representation of the Huns toward caricature. When we read Ammianus, describing Hunnic people who are barely human, or Jordanes, elaborating dramatic battle scenes, we are reading Roman anxieties as much as Hunnic reality. The recovery of anything close to historical Attila requires constant attention to what these sources were trying to accomplish with their descriptions and what interests they were serving. Priscus is the exception that makes this process possible. His account of the embassy to Attila's camp is the most valuable document we have for understanding what the Hunnic court actually looked like, how it functioned, and how Attila presented himself as a ruler. The portrait that emerges from Priscus is not flattering in a conventional sense. Attila appears taciturn, watchful, deliberate, but it is humanizing in the most important sense. It shows a ruler engaged in the actual work of ruling, receiving embassies, managing protocol, presenting himself to the world in ways calculated to reinforce his authority, and operating within a political framework that had its own logic and its own demands. The Hunnic Confederation was not a civilization in the way that Rome was a civilization. It did not build lasting infrastructure, did not generate the kind of textual record that allows internal perspectives to survive, did not organize itself around the accumulation of permanent institutional capacity. But it was organized. It was hierarchical. It managed complex external relationships with multiple major powers simultaneously. It extracted resources from those powers over decades in a way that required sustained diplomatic engagement alongside the credible threat of force. These are not the activities of chaos. They are the activities of a political system. Understanding that system matters not just for the historical record, but for what it reveals about power more generally. Attila's success depended on a specific configuration of circumstances. Two empires in structural stress, a frontier zone where mobility gave his forces advantages over more heavily equipped adversaries, a period of succession instability in the Roman West, and his own considerable political skills applied consistently over a long career. Remove any of those elements, and the story is different. The lesson is not that personal charisma and military threat are universally effective tools of power. They depend on context, and the context changed around Attila even before his death. The Eastern Empire's decision under Marcian to end the tribute payments was, in retrospect, a reading of Attila's limits. Marcian calculated that the threat of Hunnic attack on Constantinople itself was manageable given the city's defenses and the logistical challenges of a major Eastern campaign. He was right. Attila did not attack Constantinople. He turned west instead, and the Western campaigns, while impressive in geographic scope, did not produce the tributary relationship that had made the Eastern arrangement so valuable. The system had reached the limits of what it could extract from the world it operated in. The medieval legend of the Scourge of God served needs that the historical Attila did not actually serve. Medieval writers and the traditions they drew on needed an explanation for the catastrophes of the 5th century that could be integrated into a providential framework. A framework in which historical events happened because God willed them, and in which even terrible events served a larger divine purpose. Attila, as the instrument of divine punishment for Roman sins, was a more coherent story within that framework than Attila as a competent ruler who exploited structural weaknesses in failing empires. The providential narrative absorbed him and transformed him. The actual political reality, that Attila was a product of a specific historical moment, a skilled operator within a specific political system, and a ruler whose power was real but bounded, and whose empire vanished within 2 years of his death, is more complicated and more illuminating than the legend. It requires thinking about power as a relational phenomenon, contingent on circumstances, dependent on continuous demonstration, and incapable of surviving the loss of the specific individual who embodied it. What Attila built was impressive. What it tells us is more impressive still, that power does not require permanence to be real, that fear can be a more efficient tool than force, and that the most formidable political actors are not always those who build the most enduring institutions, but those who read the landscape of their moment with the greatest precision and act on what they see. He read it well, for a time.